It's great to be back up here again, a little bit sooner than I originally planned to be, but I think I'll still be here in a couple of weeks' time as well. Now, in my last message, we got up to part 3 of the series on Moses and the Exodus. And that message, we looked at the plagues of Egypt and the first part of the Exodus up to the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. Now, today in part 4, I'll be covering the story of the Exodus from the Red Sea to their time at Mount Sinai. Now, let's look at the Exodus route as described in the biblical account and the various locations mentioned on the journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai. Now, the Israelites began their journey at Ramses in Goshen. Now, there were 3 camp sites noted in the left column before they crossed the Red Sea. Now, the first of these was Succoth. Now, after Succoth, they went to Etham, and then they made a turn off the regular road before camping at the Red Sea there. Now, after they crossed the Red Sea, they travelled for 3 days in the wilderness of Shur, which is also called the wilderness of Etham, in Numbers 33. Now, notice Etham is noted as being on the Egyptian side where they crossed the Red Sea, and the wilderness of Etham is just on the other side. So we see it on both sides as Etham. Now, the word Etham has a couple of possible generic meanings. One is that it means red, being very similar to Edom, and the other is at Tihama, which is Arabic for land sloping towards the sea. Now, 3 days after they crossed the Red Sea, they reached Marah, where there was bitter water. And then they went to the oasis of Elim, where there were 12 wells and 70 palm trees. Now, after Elim, they actually made another camp at the Red Sea, again according to Numbers 33, verse 10. Now, possible reasons for doing so, going to the Red Sea again, may have been to collect weapons that were washed up on the seashore, as mentioned in the account of Josephus. Now, Glenn Fritz suggests that only a small group of Israelites went to do this while the rest of the Israelites rested at Elim. Now, from there they went to the wilderness of Sin, and it was here that God first gave them quail and the miracle of manna, or bread from heaven. Now, in the wilderness of Sin, we are told that a month had passed by since they left Egypt. Now, this is the first time marker that we're given in the Bible after they left Egypt. So if the camps are evenly spread out, then the Red Sea crossing most likely occurred about 3 weeks after leaving Egypt. Now, 3 days later, they were at Marah, then they were at Elim, probably at the 4-week stage, and then 2 days later, or 30 days after leaving Egypt, they reached the wilderness of Sin. Now, if the crossing occurred at Nuweiba on the Gulf of Aqaba, as we looked at last time, then it took close to 20 days to get there. Now, their average speed would have been about 15 miles or 25 kilometres per day. And if they're walking 10 hours a day, that would make for an average pace of about 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometres an hour, which is basically a slow walking pace. Now, after the wilderness of Sin, there were 2 other campsites, Dophka and Alush, as mentioned in Numbers 33, although they're not mentioned in the Exodus account. Now, after those 2 campsites, the next place on the journey was Rephidim, where God split the rock of Horeb and water poured forth, as mentioned in Exodus 17. Now, later in that same chapter, they have to fight the Amalekites there at the same location there at Rephidim. And from there, they finally got to Mount Sinai. Now, at the start of Exodus 19, it says, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt. And the Exodus started halfway into the 1st month of the year called Abib or Nisan. Now, when it says the 3rd month, does it mean that it was the 3rd month of the year, or was it their 3rd month of travel, meaning they'd been travelling for at least 8 to 9 weeks? And personally, I think it's more likely to mean the 3rd month of the Hebrew calendar, which would have put it close to Pentecost. Now, the Jews traditionally believe the 10 Commandments were given on the Feast of Pentecost, which is between 7 and 8 weeks after Passover, depending on how far into the week-long Feast of Tabernacle and Bread that the Sunday for the wave sheaf occurs. Now we pick up the story of the Exodus after the Red Sea crossing in Exodus 15, where we read, "So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. So some substance with a bitter taste was obviously contaminating the water. Now, was there something in the tree which absorbed this bitter substance? Well, we don't know, but even if there was, it's more likely that this was also a miraculous event that was happening here. Now, God then used the healing of that water as an object lesson to encourage them to obey Him. And as a result, they will be free of the diseases that the Egyptians had experienced. And God then tells them, "I am the Lord who heals you," reminding them and us that He is a God who can heal and restore us. Now after Marah, they continued on to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and there was water that they could camp by. And this is probably the 4th Sabbath after they've left Egypt. And as I mentioned before, there's a second camp by the Red Sea after Elim. Now in Exodus 14:30 it notes that the Israelites saw the dead bodies washed up on the shore, but exactly when was this? Now Josephus says it happened the next day after the crossing, but perhaps he was mistaken about the timing, or a few bodies did wash up the next day, and a much greater number of bodies washed up ashore further downstream of the Gulf when they camped by the Red Sea the second time. Now Glenn Fritz believes that this detour to the Gulf of Aqaba was only by a portion of the Israelites, and this was for the purpose of collecting the weapons of the Egyptians. Now the highest mountain range in the land of Midian is the Jabal el-Lawz range. Now two of the most prominent peaks are Jabal el-Lawz and Jabal al-Maqla, a little further to its southeast. Now Jabal el-Lawz is the highest peak in this range. Now its name means the mountain of the almond, which is a relatively recent name for this mountain. Now as for whether this is a match for the biblical Mount Sinai, there is no prominent plain in front of it as required in the book of Exodus for all the Israelites to camp before, as required in that book. Now the third highest peak in the range is Jabal al-Maqla. Now on its top it has a blackened peak. Now many think this blackened peak was caused by God and the smoking fire of His presence on those mountains. But it should be noted that this black layer that forms over its pink granite is a feature of quite a number of mountains in this region. Now many who argue for this mountain to be Mount Sinai mistakenly refer to it as Jabal el-Lawz, the high peak further north. Now Jabal al-Maqla matches several key natural attributes for being the biblical Mount Sinai. And it's got an enormous large plain in front of it that could have allowed as many as 2 to 3 million Israelites to camp in front of it. And there's also a remnant of a major stream that used to formerly run through the plain. And it also has a nearby cave as required in the story of Elijah, who fled there centuries later. Now in this photo you can see the large plain in front of Jabal al-Maqla, which is a part of Wadi al-Abayid. Now in front of the plain near the base of the mountain there are remains of a creek that flowed down from the mountains, coloured here in green. Now next to it in the white box there you can see a V-shaped structure where animals might have been corralled for sacrifices. Now if you are going to do sacrifices, you want to have a plentiful supply of water nearby. And Deuteronomy 9:21 it speaks of a brook that descended out of the mouth. Now one of the more interesting features in Jabal al-Maqla offers supporting proof that it could be the true Mount Sinai is that V-shaped structure that I referred to here is shown a little bit more close up. Now there's these stone marble pillars just to the side of Now, it's been suggested that it was the site of an altar, and the enclosure was used to fence in animals for sacrifices. And some have suggested that the marble pillars here might have been 12 stones set up for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Glenn Fritz's examination of these marble bases indicate that they bear the manufacturing techniques used at the time of the Roman Empire. Now, he suggests that perhaps Jews from the diaspora may have been responsible for them, perhaps wanting to create a memorial at this important site. Now, on the lower of the two peaks of Jabal al-Maqla, there is this cave on the mountain which fits the story of Elijah's flight to Horeb, staying in a cave where God spoke to him in a still small voice. Now, if the way is the correct crossing site, there are a few possible ways they could get to Mount Sinai. Now, one would be to go north, then find a suitable way to ascend up the coastal mountains, and then go south. Now, going north is no candidate for Elim unless you ascend up the coastal range, and then it makes no sense to go back down to the Red Sea. Now, according to Glenn Fritz's information, the most direct route to Jabal al-Maqla, shown here in purple, is theoretically possible for a multitude to travel. However, it does not match the clues of the journey as well. There's no oasis candidate for Elim, and then there's no second Red Sea encampment. And while God could have taken that direct way, instead he chose a longer way. Now, this could have been for the purpose of testing the Israelites, and Josephus' account suggests that the collecting of the weapons was a possible second purpose for the second Red Sea encampment. Now, the route that Ron White favoured is shown here in brown. Now, he has them going south, setting up very tight mountainous terrain, and going to an oasis close to the Red Sea that he believes is Elim, before then heading northeast through the wilderness of Sin to the famous split rock on the western side of the Jabal al-Lawz range, and then going around the northern side of that range to its eastern side. Now, his proposed Elim oasis site is quite spectacular from the air seen in the aerial photo in the bottom right. However, it is actually quite small, and it lacks a suitable exit route to reach the second Red Sea encampment. Now, a major issue with this route also, shown in yellow here, near Ron White's proposed Mara, is some of these areas are just too difficult for really a multitude to pass through, very tight terrain. Now, Glenn Fritz proposes a much wider geographical area in and near the Wadi, just further south of where Ron White places Elim. Now, he favours the broader Wadi called Wadi al-Hamad, and the wells and the well-vegetated area near al-Bad. Now, there is a further oasis at the end of the Wadi near the Red Sea, which has a tradition of being the springs of Moses. Now, al-Bad was anciently known as the city of Midian, and there are strong traditions linking al-Bad with Moses and Jethro, including a well thought to be the one that Moses drew from when he arrived in Midian. Now, the main difference between Glenn Fritz's route and Ron White's route is the difference in distance they cover after they reach the wilderness of Sin. Now, from Egypt, they took a whole month to get to the wilderness of Sin, which White places on the western side of Mount Sinai. Now, Ron White's route has them over a month, travelling the next month, only about a quarter of the same distance they travelled the previous month. Now, to me, this argues very strongly in favour of them going south and not north after reaching Elim. And to me, this is the best evidence for the rather circuitous route to the south to the next mountain pass that is navigable by a large multitude. Now, going that southern route would rule out the Israelites going by the way of the famous split rock on the western side of the Jabal al-Lawz range. Now, after Elim, the Israelites' next camp was the wilderness of Sin. Now, notice that Exodus 16:1 says that they entered this region on the 15th day of the second month. Now, Now they left Egypt on the 15th day of the first month, so it was a whole month or 30 days later. Now Glenn Fritz, author of the Exodus Mysteries of Midian, Sinai and Jebel Laws, shown here in the photo on the right, proposes that the wilderness of Sin was the very large coastal plain to the east of the Straits of Tyran. Now it's rather barren with little vegetation today, as seen in the photo on the right. Now one of the strongest points in favour of this location is the expression that all of the congregation came into the wilderness. Now if the Israelites travelled with about 100 people wide at any point, or about 200 metres wide, the entire length of the Israelite train of people would have been somewhere between 20 and 40 kilometres long. Now this large wide plain could easily fit the entire 2 million Israelites in one place. Now Fritz also suggests that these similar expressions, wilderness of Sin and wilderness of Sinai, mean east and far east. Now even today the suffix Sinai is used for China or the Far East. For example, the war between China and Japan around the time of the Second World War is referred to as the Sino-Japanese War. Now, using Glenn Fritz's route, I've developed my own theory as to the timing of the Exodus based on two rather simple points. Now, the first key point of my theory is that the Israelites were keeping the Sabbath, and that most of the encampments along the way were for resting on the Sabbath, with possible additional spots for where the journey got tougher, such as going uphill. Now, after the Red Sea crossing, they didn't have to travel as urgently with the Egyptian army now destroyed, so they could take an extra midweek stop there a bit more often. And those are shown in grey here in between the Sabbath stops. Now, the second key point is that they reached Mount Sinai by at least 3 days before Pentecost. Now, the full chart of my timeline plus maps of the proposed routes from Red Sea to Mount Sinai, I will include that on the handout, which I almost finished last night in the wee hours of the morning, but I'll have when I do part 5. Now, when they reached the wilderness of Sin, the Israelites complained bitterly to Moses that they'd rather have died in Egypt than die in the wilderness from hunger, as they thought was about to happen. And that's despite all the miracles that God had done in front of their own eyes, such as the plagues, the Red Sea crossing only about 10 days earlier, the curing of the waters of Mara, not to mention the ever-present miracle of the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire that went before them. So we see even here that great miracles don't guarantee faith, as the Israelites proved. Now, despite their weak unbelief, God had mercy on them, like we read in Psalm 103, verse 14. He knows our frame and remembers that we are but dust. So God then provided them both with quails in the evening and manna in the morning. Now, God possibly guided the migration of quails north for the summer to where they were. Now, during the day, the quails would work hard to cross over the Straits of Tyran, and once they reached landfall again, they would be quite tired and easy to pick up. Now, in verse 4, God said, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you." Now, the next morning, God gave them a bread-like substance that fell from the sky. And they called it manna, meaning, "What is it?" as they weren't sure what it was. Now, God used it to test them as to whether they would keep His Sabbath or not. Now, it normally melted if kept for too long. And God gave them a double portion on the 6th day for them to collect, which did melt, and they would provide for them on the Sabbath, and then there would be none to collect on the Sabbath. Now, we're told that it had a sweet taste like wafers made with honey, and it was like coriander seed. And that God provided this manna for the full 40 years that they were in the wilderness. Now, there's a Syrian text that tells of a time that, and I quote, the heavens rain oil, the wadis, the waters, run with honey. Now, I would also record a time when there were streams of milk and streams of nectar. Now, under the heat of day the manna would melt. Now much of that would have actually melted in the rivers, and so the rivers became milky in appearance. And so naturally when the scouts returned to the people, they described it as a land that flowed with milk and honey. And it's also interesting in Joel 3 verse 18 that there is a millennial prophecy that speaks about hills flowing with milk. Now after the wilderness of sin, the Israelites then went to Rephidim where there was no water. And that's why God made water come out of the rock. And that rock is referred to as being in Horeb. Now they later left Rephidim and went to Mount Sinai. Now in Psalm 106:19 it says that they made the golden calf in Horeb. Horeb is also a name that was given to the mountain of God in the story of the burning bush in Exodus 3. Now notice that Rephidim and Mount Sinai are both in Horeb, though Rephidim and Sinai are different locations. So we see here that the geographical term Horeb is meant to convey a larger region than just the mountain of God and its close surrounds. Now the Hebrew root of the word Horeb means dryness, desolation, and Rephidim means resting places. Now Glenn Fritz believes that Horeb refers to that whole inland high plateau region to the east of the coastal plain of Midian. Now at a place called Rephidim, known as being in Horeb, we read in Exodus 17:6 that Moses stood on the rock in Horeb and he struck the rock and God made water come forth for the people to drink. Now on the western side of Mount Sinai there is this absolutely extraordinary rock that is split in two and that has clear evidence of strong water erosion at its base. Now in regards to the split rock, Glenn Fritz writes in his book The Exodus Mysteries, I quote, despite its unique beauty there are several difficulties with this site being part of the Exodus route. First, it is hard to devise a navigable route that includes this location in the sequence of 7 Exodus encampments encountered between the sea crossing and Mount Sinai. Secondly, it is off the beaten track, being at least 16 kilometres east of the main northwest thoroughfare in Wadi al-Afel. End of quote. Now he notes the water erosion at the base of the rock can be explained as a result of rain over the millennia, as it was a much wetter period just long before the Exodus. Now it doesn't appear to require a supernatural explanation despite how amazing it looks. Now to illustrate that point, the centre photo here shows another amazing split rock that is found in Saudi Arabia about 300 kilometres away at Al-Nasra. Now in Deuteronomy 8:15 it says that God brought forth water for you out of the flinty rock. Now the Hebrew word translated as flinty rock is the word sur, T-S-U-R. Now it suggests that the rock at Horeb was a flinty or hard type of rock that is an igneous rather than a sedimentary rock. Now the split rock there that is quite popularised is sedimentary sandstone rather than hard igneous rock. Now the clue of the rock being like flint better fits Glenn Fritz's proposed candidate for Horeb, which is Albatra. Now the name Albatra means the rock. Now there is geological evidence of water flowing patterns adjacent to this Albatra formation that could theoretically provide widespread water access for the Hebrews and their herds. Now after the story of the water coming out of the rock at Horeb, we read the story of the attack on Israel by Amalek at Rephidim. Now Samuel later in 1 Samuel 15:2 spoke of Amalek ambushing Israel. Now when Israel counterattacked, Moses stood on a hill with the rod of God in his hand. Now in the account it says that when Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and when he let it down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Now, following their departure from Rephidim, if Glenn Fritz's route is correct, they traversed the relatively easy high plateau to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the large plain on the eastern side of Jabal al-Maqla. Now, the distance of Glenn Fritz's route from Nuweiba on the Red Sea to Mount Sinai is almost identical to the route he proposes from Egypt to Nuweiba on the Red Sea at just over 270 miles or 435 kilometres. That's about the distance from Caboolture down to, say, Coffs Harbour, or about 5 hours drive by car. Now, at about 15 kilometres per day, that would take them about 4 weeks to walk. They walked about 10 hours per day at a slow walking pace. Now, in Exodus 18, we then read the story of Moses' father-in-law coming for a visit with Moses' wife Zipporah and their 2 sons, Gershom and Eliezer. Now, Jethro rejoiced in the wonderful news that God had freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, and then seeing how Moses was taking far too much himself to help and judge the people. So Jethro basically counselled him to delegate his work amongst some of the leading men. And Moses would see he was responsive to Jethro's advice and did as he said. Now notice here 4 key qualities that are needed of men who lead other people. They have to be 1, competent and able men. 2, fear God over men. 3, be men who are honest. And 4, men who hate covetousness. In other words, they're not in it for the money and won't take bribes. Now, once they were all set up at the base of Mount Sinai, we read in Exodus 19, starting in verse 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and let them be ready the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set the balance for the people all around, saying, Take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain and touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death." And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, and Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice, then the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And God spoke all these words, saying, "I am the Lord God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." And then he proceeded to give them the 10 Commandments. Now imagine for a moment what this world would be like if everyone worshipped the true God and no other gods, kept his special time off the Sabbath, if everyone honoured their parents, if no one killed anyone else, if no one stole anything, if no one lied and everyone told the truth, and if everyone was faithful to their husband or wife. Now that is the kind of world we would have if everyone obeyed the 10 Commandments. Now, some of the more liberal theologians in mainstream Christianity would have us believe that the 10 Commandments are some kind of burden, that they're negative, and you're just being plain old legalistic if you insist on people keeping them today. Now, God has just brought them out of bondage in Egypt. Is it logical that God would then give him a law that would put them back into bondage again? It just doesn't make sense. Now, the Apostle John wrote the very opposite of that liberal view. He wrote in 1 John 5:3, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." Now, after God gave the 10 Commandments, we read, "And all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain burning. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood far off. Then they said to Moses, 'You speak with us and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die.' And Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so you may not sin." So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. Now, according to Hebrew tradition, all nations heard the roaring of the lawgiving told in Exodus 20. Now, according to the Babylonian Talmud, it writes, these words, meaning the Ten Commandments, were not heard by Israel alone, but by all the inhabitants of the earth. The divine voice divided itself into 70 tongues of men so that all might understand it. Now, also according to Hebrew tradition, the Ten Commandments were given on the day of Pentecost. Now, when the Holy Spirit was given to the church on this same festival of Pentecost almost 1,500 years later, there was actually a similar phenomenon that actually occurred as that described in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, Acts 2:11 says, "We hear them speaking in our own tongues the wonderful works of God." And the wonderful works of God that the apostles were preaching were heard by everyone in their own language, just as described in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the fact that this miracle exactly parallels what happened when the Ten Commandments were given according to Jewish tradition makes a strong case that the Ten Commandments were also given on the day of Pentecost. Now, Jabal Makla means mountain of the quarry, because there is a small quarry where white marble was quarried. Now, this is a highly prized stone, and it's quite possible that this highly favoured stone was used by God to create the stone tablets on which the Ten Commandments were written onto. Now, after God had carved out the Ten Commandments, following his audible giving of them to the people, it says in Exodus 32 that Moses went down from the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. The tablets were written on both sides. Now, the typical idea that most people have of what the Ten Commandments look like are the giant stone tablets, like you see Moses holding onto in the Ten Commandments movie. Now, it says here that they were in his hand, and because they were written on both sides, this indicates there was probably insufficient room to only be written on one side of them. So we see that the 2 tablets were probably much smaller than the mental image that most of us have of the tablets that the Ten Commandments were written onto. Now, remember that most cuneiform tablets of the time would normally fit into the palm of someone's hand. Now, from late in Exodus chapter 20 through to the end of Exodus 23, God gave a series of lesser laws that further expanded on the principles of the Ten Commandments. Now, the Ten Commandments give the broadest specific examples of how to obey God and show love to him and to our neighbours. Now, these were the Ten Commandments that God directly spoke to all of Israel. All of the later statutes were given to Moses, who then wrote them down. Now, the statutes found in Exodus through to Deuteronomy go further and expand on the Ten Commandments. Now, life is complex, and so God, in his love, gave Israel further detail and specifics as to how to show love for him and others through the statutes and a selection of judgments. Now, statutes are secondary laws that are made by lawmakers. Now, judgments, on the other hand, refer to judicial decisions made by a judge such as God. Now, judgments can be punishments for breaking existing laws, or they can also be laws that tell us how to best apply the principles of other commands. Common mainstream Christian view of the Old Testament, including the Ten Commandments, is that with the end of the Old Covenant after the death of Jesus, the Old Testament laws were done away with, as they didn't exist until they were given at Mount Sinai. And this idea that they didn't exist before Mount Sinai is easily disproven in the Bible. Now, we're told in Genesis 26:5 that Abraham kept the commandments, statutes, and laws of the eternal. Now, how could Abraham keep something that was not yet given? Now, additional statutes, no doubt, were given at Mount Sinai, but there was already a sizable body of law that Abraham was familiar with, including the Ten Commandments. Now, a couple of chapters earlier than when the Ten Commandments are given, in chapter 18, it says that Moses told Jethro, "I make known the statutes of God and his laws." Now, of the Ten Commandments, 8 of them begin with "thou shalt not." And this has led to the idea that the Ten Commandments are negative and restrictive. Now, why do 8 of them start with "thou shalt not"? Well, you have to think about it in terms of how a parent gradually teaches a child how to behave and live a moral life. The way that God teaches us, his way of life in the Bible, is much the same way. Now, we, like the Israelites, when they came out of Egypt, are like spiritual infants when we first start to learn about God's way. The Ten Commandments are mostly specific actions where God tells us not to do certain things. The Ten Commandments warn us against the most important actions that can harm us and other people. The statutes and judgments, again, mostly deal with specific actions rather than principles, and there is more of a balance between positive actions and negative ones. Now, as the people of Israel did not have God's Spirit and were spiritually mature, God had to be very specific and tell them what they could and could not do. Now, when we get to the New Testament, most of the new teaching introduced about God's way of life focuses on attitudes like the fruits of God's Spirit and the principles behind the laws of God. Now, some laws or judgments may be temporary in nature. And the Apostle Paul in Hebrews 9 spoke of laws such as sacrifices, food and drink offerings, and washings, which were temporary. Now, the holy days that God gave to Israel are not included in that listing. Now, in the instructions for at least 3 of the festivals that he gave in Leviticus 23, God states that they are a statute forever in all your generations. Now, Israel was a civic nation and could administer national laws with judges rendering sentences and carrying out justice. Now, we do not have that today. And we in the church are a congregation, but not a civil government. So only those laws that don't require civil government and justice courts apply to us today. Now, when God gave the Ten Commandments in Mount Sinai after he brought them out of Egypt, he offered to be their guide and to bless them physically if they would obey him. Now, the physical blessings of material abundance, good health and prosperity, God offered them and discussed in the first half of Leviticus 26, as well as Deuteronomy 28. Now, these blessings were conditional upon their obedience to the laws and statutes. Now, those chapters are full of the word "if." If you obey me, you'll have these blessings. If, however, they disobeyed, in contrast, there would be hardship and a lack of blessing, which are the curses in the second half of Leviticus 26. Now, after the Ten Commandments and a significant portion of the statutes were given to Moses in Exodus 24, we read, "And the people responded by saying, 'All that the Lord has said, we will do, and be obedient.' And Moses then sprinkled blood upon them, saying, 'This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you.'" And this proposal, which was accepted by the nation of Israel, became known as the Old Covenant. Now, in Mystery of the Ages, Herbert Armstrong wrote the following: "God entered into a covenant with them, making them his nation. He also represented a marriage covenant with Israel, the wife, promising obedience to her husband, God. Now, what wasn't promised in the Old Covenant that is a part of the New Covenant was free access to the Holy Spirit and eternal life. The New Covenant is made on better promises, as Paul talked about in Hebrews 8:6. Now, in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, we read, "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Now, in Deuteronomy 4, verses 6 to 8, God also said, Therefore, be careful to observe them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples. You will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has God so near to it, as the Lord our God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon him? And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in all this law which I set before you this day? Now God wanted his people to be a light on a hill to draw and attract the Gentiles to him, rather than creating an exclusive religious system just for Israel that the Gentiles could not be a part of. Now God wanted a free, obedient and happy people, free of the many burdens that governments put on people today. Other peoples would look at them thinking, how can we be free from the burdens that our governments put on us? And from that could spread the idea, hey, let's worship Israel's God. Let Israel's God be our king. Now God's purpose for Israel is that the whole world would be blessed through the descendants of Jacob as they follow God's laws and be a good example for the rest of the nations around them. Now, as part of the ratification of the Old Covenant with Israel, there was a covenant meal. We read this in verses 9 to 11 of Exodus 24. Then Moses went up, also Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and it was like the very heavens in its clarity. So they saw God, and they ate and drank. Now this would have been an incredible sight, an event to be a part of. And the God that they saw was not God the Father, as Jesus said in John 6:46. Not that anyone has seen the Father except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. Now Jesus has seen the Father, but not men, so who is this God? Now the answer to that is in 1 Corinthians 10:4. The Apostle Paul, speaking of the Israelites who came out of Egypt, said, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Now in the Old Testament period, Jesus Christ acted as the spokesman of God. He was the God that Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders saw and amazingly got to have a meal with. Now they didn't see him in full glory, else they would have died. Now he manifested as a human, but with some additional glory, such as the pavement of sapphire stone, with incredible clarity and transparency that was under his feet. You can imagine it being a little bit like someone rolling out the red carpet at a gala event like the Oscars. What an amazing experience this must have been. Now after that meal we read, then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone, and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. The sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. So Moses went into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Now God had spoken the 10 Commandments, and now he was going to give Moses those commandments carved onto stone. Now Moses went up with his assistant Joshua. Now this is the second time we hear about Joshua, the first time being with the battle against Amalek. Now Moses goes up to the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Now after the great sin of the people with the golden calf, he would go up a second time for another 40 days and 40 nights. And that second time he would be fasting all that time in response to the people's sin. Now the next chapters of the book of the Exodus deal with the instructions for building the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the altars, and the other items that were in the tabernacle, plus the garments of the priests. Now it didn't take long for Israel to break the second commandment when Moses went up to the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Now in their impatience, they coerced Aaron to make a god to go before them. Now they wanted a form they could see and allow them to feel connected with a God, or the God, that could take them into the promised land. Now the people said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." Now they saw the idol as a representative of the true God, the God that brought them out of Egypt, and celebrated their own feast to the Lord. Now God, however, did not see it that way. In verse 8, God said, "They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a golden calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it." Now notice he says they have worshipped it, not me. Now later in history we read how Jeroboam repeated the same sin when the northern kingdom of Israel split off from Judah. In fact, he even used the very same line when he set up 2 golden calves in Dan and Bethel, saying, "Behold the Elohim of Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt." Now when God saw the great sin of the Israelites with the golden calf, the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore leave me alone, that my wrath may consume hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make out of you a great nation." Then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, "Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, 'He brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, 'I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.'" Now God tells Moses, "Leave me alone, that I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation." Now if you were in Moses' position, would you get out of God's way if he said that to you? Now this is an incredibly courageous and selfless act on God's part, to intercede for the people when God is just so angry, and rightfully so. Now not only did he show incredible concern for the people, he presented God with a very clever and persuasive argument. And it was so persuasive that God actually changed his mind and relented from the harm that he was about to do. Now this brings us to the 5th lesson that we can learn from the life of Moses. Intercede for others with the deep concern that Moses had for Israel. Now near the end of Exodus 32 and verses 31 and 32, Moses said, "Oh, these people have committed a great sin and have made for themselves a golden god. Yet now, if you will not forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written." Now this is extraordinary selflessness, to be willing to give up your own chance at salvation and eternal life for God to forgive these sinners. Now how much of our prayer time is just focused on our needs compared to praying for the needs of others? And we need to have the same deep love and concern for others that Moses showed here. Now after interceding for the people the first time, Moses goes down to see what's happening with his own eyes. We read here, "So it was, as soon as he came near the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing. So Moses' anger became hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Then he took the calf which they had made, burnt it in the fire, and ground it to powder. And he scattered it on the water and made the children of Israel to drink it. Now when Moses saw that the people were unrestrained, Moses stood in the entrance of the camp and said, 'Whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me.' And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. And he said to them, 'Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let every man put his sword on his side and go in and out from entrance to entrance throughout the camp, and let every man kill his brother, every man his companion, and every man his neighbour.' So the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day." Now the Levites from Moses' own tribe stood up with him and executed God's judgment on those who continued not only with the adultery, but probably harlotry that went on along with it. And it says that some 3,000 people were killed in the process. Now, maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's not, but that was the same number of people who were also baptised on the day of Pentecost. Now in Exodus 34 verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 stubs of stone, like the first ones, and I will write on these tablets the words that were on the first tablets which you broke." And because Moses broke the first copy of the Ten Commandments, he had to do the hard, laborious work of cutting out 2 new tablets, and then God would then make another copy for him. Now, one monolithic structure shown in the top left here, that there have been found numerous gold petroglyphs on close to Jabal al-Maqla. Now, Glenn Fritz writes the following about these petroglyphs. The Hebrews' cultic worship of a golden bull calf likely sprung from their experiences in their Egyptian tenure. However, the indigenous people of the Arabian Peninsula also have signs of cultic activity involving bovine figures. Now, if the Hebrews did visit Jabal al-Maqla, the bovine petroglyphs may have already been there to greet them. If so, perhaps these images serve as a blunt reminder of the gods that they left in Egypt and inspired them to resort to their worship. Now, about 6 miles north from where the Israelites were encamped is a place with numerous standing stones that appears to be a giant cemetery. Now, Glenn Fritz, in his book on the Exodus Mysteries, writes, "Of the sites presented in this chapter, the cemetery site holds the most intrigue relative to the Exodus. Concerning its size and character, it is difficult to explain these remains in such a remote setting which lacks a history of significant historical human activity. If the Exodus is considered as a hypothesis, a mass burial of the 3,000 slain on Mount Sinai would be an explanation." Now in Exodus 33, God says, "I will send my angel before you. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." And when the people heard this bad news, they mourned. And Moses said, "For how then will it be known to your people and I that have found grace in your sight, except you go with us? So we shall separate your people and I from all the people who are upon the face of the earth." So the Lord said to Moses, "I will also do this thing that you have spoken, for you have found grace in my sight, and I know you by name." Now God was originally planning to send an angel, perhaps Michael, instead of leading them himself into the promised land because of their disobedient heart. And Moses beseeched God to change his mind and be with them as they entered the promised land. And once again, Moses is able to persuade God to change his mind. Now this brings us to the 6th lesson that we can learn from the life of Moses. God does sometimes change his mind, so we should be bold in our prayers and put forth a persuasive argument with our requests to him. Now often there are several options as to how things can play out. As they say, there's so many ways to skin a cat. Now God is always willing to hear us argue for a different course with the things that we pray about and change his preferred option to our preferred option if we can put forth a persuasive argument. Now, another example of this happening in Israel's history is Hezekiah's prayer not to die so soon, where God also changed his mind. Now, in verse 11 here, Exodus 33, we read, "So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend." And that kind of shows the sort of intimate friendship that was there between God and Moses. Now God manifested himself to look like a man that could be seen with human eyes when he conveyed a lot of his instructions to Moses and spoke with him face to face. And Moses here then asked to see him not in a manifested human-looking form, but as he really looks like in full blazing glory. God said to Moses, "You cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live." And the Lord said, "Here is a place by me, and you shall stand on the rock. So it shall be while my glory passes by, I'll put you in the cleft of the rock, and I'll cover you with my hand while I pass by. And I'll take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Now notice that God didn't tell Moses that I can't show you how I look in my full glory as I have got no shape. Instead, God says that if you see me in my full glory, front on you will die from the power and the brightness, but it should be okay for you to at least see my back in my full glorified appearance. So we can see here that God having a back and other features is not just figurative language, but is quite literal. Now Moses then went up to the mountain for another 40 days and 40 nights. And this time he fasted the whole time for the sin of the Israelites. And no doubt he was sustained physically in God's presence, as one can only go 10 days without water at most before dying of thirst. Now after spending all that time in God's presence, his face was then glowing and shining without realising it. Now when the people feared to come near him, he chose to put a veil over his face whenever he was near them. Now the last few chapters of the book of Exodus deal with the building of the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and the various items that went into the tabernacle. Now at this point in the story, if you're watching the Ten Commandments movie, the movie's been going on for about 3.5 hours, and we're all getting very sleepy. Now in those 3.5 plus hours, Cecil B. DeMille took the story up to the golden calf, with Moses getting angry and breaking the tablets. And he then jumps ahead to the very end of the Exodus story, with Moses on Mount Nebo watching the Israelites head across to the Jordan. Now there's still quite a lot to the rest of the story of the Exodus, and much of that story is much lesser known than what we've covered up to so far. And we'll cover those lesser known events of the back part of the Exodus journey in the next part of lessons from Moses and the Exodus, and I hope to complete this series then. And that should be hopefully about 2 weeks' time, so thanks for your attention.